Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's talk is entitled Inferior Data Part 5. We're continuing our series looking at the problems with observational studies. That's in contrast to experimental studies, where we're able to control and manipulate a specific variable of interest in order to determine whether causation exists. In the case of observational studies, we lack the power and strength of an experimental study's ability to infer causation, and that's often because we can't control for chance, bias, or confounders or reverse causation that come up in observational studies as well as in experimental studies, but that are controlled for in the experimental study either through randomization or through the design of the experiment. Today I'm going to give you another example of an observational study, but one that had a happier ending than our last one. Remember in the Scandinavian painters study, the observational study that ultimately led policymakers to start intervening and suing on behalf of painters withdrew their study results after being confronted with strong evidence of reverse causation that ultimately led them to conclude that the observational study design that they had implemented was not strong enough to prove causation. Here in this case, we're going to talk about the instance of John Snow, a British scientist who was at the heart of the solution to the 1854 Broad Street Pump cholera outbreak in London, England. What John Snow did was nothing short of remarkable, but he relied on observational science mostly to come to his results. So what we're saying here in today's study is that observational science, while not perhaps perfect, can still help provide helpful insights as a hypothesis building mechanism. Ultimately, though, what you'll see, even in the John Snow case, was that manipulation was necessary in order to create a causal conclusion. In other words, no manipulation, no causation is typically the mantra that we've been saying, and it held true here in John Snow's case. Let's look at the facts of what went on in England. This story is related by Summers in his 1989 article, and in the sequence of events the following occurred. On August 31st of 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in London. There were 127 people dead within 3 days, living on or near Broad Street in Soho, a district of London. By September 10th, a mere 10 days later, 500 people were dead, and the outbreak was starting to become pestilent. Snow lived on Frith Street nearby, and he'd been researching cholera out of interest for years. The prevailing theory at the time was that it was passed by, quote, miasma in the atmosphere, some sort of communicable disease by breathing, but nobody was quite sure exactly how it was transmitted. But 20 years of his own personal research had led Snow to a different conclusion. He thought, although he had not proven it, that it was passed by swallowing contaminated water or expectorate, spitting, or other bodily fluids that were transmitted from person to person, rather than an airborne illness. He began interviewing individuals, and he faithfully recorded the residences on a map of where infected individuals were residing. And here's his map that he created. In his map, you'll notice the little black dots are all of the different houses where a member of the household had cholera. And you'll notice that it's all clustered in the center of the map with some outlying to the south and the southeast in the region and a few to the southwest with small outlying numbers of dots. A few to the east, nothing farther than Dean Street, nothing north of Oxford Street, and nothing that much west of Regent Street here in this diagram. It's all centrally localized. And the question is why? Why was this all happening in one area? If this was airborne, why wasn't it spreading to other parts of London? And he couldn't quite figure it out, but he thought there must be something in a water supply issue here, and he centered his suspicion on a pump labeled P and highlighted in yellow here on Broad Street, thinking maybe the water supply was contaminated coming out of this pump and people were drinking from it. Of course, he had no proof. He was just making observations about where the people were, and based on his hunch that this was a waterborne illness, started looking at pumps. A pure observational study. He carefully investigated people, however, being a good scientist, who had died not necessarily in this region. And what he found was that there was a woman and daughter who lived in West Hampstead, and they had died of cholera, but they had lived in Broad Street years before. And the question was, well, why did they die out in West Hampstead? How is that possible? Did they move and they had contracted something years prior? He investigated more closely, and he determined that they had asked their servant to bring water from the Broad Street pump because they still preferred the taste of the Broad Street water to their local water supply in Hampstead. And they had done so on August 31st, the first day of the outbreak. Among the 70 workers who were in a Broad Street brewery, he also found curiously that none of them had contracted cholera. But upon investigation, he determined that all of them were given free beer every day, and so they never drank any water at all. This led him to further results that, excluding populations that were not affected but who had not drunk from the pump, furthered his evidence that in fact the pump was the culprit. Then he also found that there was an army officer who lived in St. John's Wood, another district, who had died, but he had dined on Wardour Street, which was very close to the Broad Street pump, and he had drunk a glass of water at that Wardour Tavern, and indeed that water had come from the Broad Street pump. So in all cases, he had found either that the people who had gotten cholera had drunk from the pump, or those living in the proximity of the pump who had not drunk from the pump did not get cholera. This to him seemed like conclusive evidence that in fact the pump was the culprit. But Snow didn't stop there. If he had, you would still only have an observational study, and while perhaps you might be convinced that in fact that's enough evidence for you to do something about it, Snow had to take the following step. He went to the authorities with his evidence, and he told them, I think we need to, in fact, look further at what's going on with the water in this pump. He took a sample of water from the pump and looked at it under a microscope, and he found indeed that it contained white flocculent particles, evidence of cholera in the water, or so he thought. And with that, finally, he went to the Board of Guardians of St. James Parish, where the pump was located. And although they were skeptical, they agreed on his presentation of evidence to try what we would now call an experiment, which was to remove the pump handle to prohibit further drinking from the pump. This, of course, is cutting off the water supply to an entire district of London, and quite controversial. But they did so out of desperation and because they had no other leads to how to stop this. Although the spread of cholera had been declining for several days, potentially because so many people who had been drinking from the pump were already dead, it abruptly stopped as soon as that pump handle was removed. This is the medical article in the Medical Society of London that wrote up the details of Dr. Snow's study, and here's the actual Broad Street pump and its handle that was removed during the outbreak. So here you have the story of John Snow, using observational science in order to reach a conclusion. Were there potential confounders he didn't control for? Of course. Could have been a number of different things that occurred that would have been confounding his study. Could it have been that reverse causation occurred, that people got cholera who were drinking from the pump, and that instead of the pump causing the cholera caused them to go drink from that water supply? Maybe they all got thirstier and they went there as opposed to a different source like beer. Maybe you could create a story like that. Or is it possible that this was pure chance? Of course, we can't rule out pure chance in an observational study of this nature. But what really sealed the deal was the manipulation of the experiment, removing the pump handle. Once an experimental form was set up, we really had data that we could then use. The cholera stopped after removing the pump handle. So when we ask the question, did John Snow, through his cholera map, observe and thereby prove that contaminated Broad Street pump water caused the cholera outbreak? My answer to this would be no. Not until he did the experiment. No manipulation, no causation. He did, however, get it right, and observational science often can create a hypothesis that will lead us in the direction of creating an effective experiment to test and therefore create data that are effective and not ineffective data. So going back to our chart that we see each of these classes when we're talking about inferior data, when establishing causation, experimental studies create causal knowledge. Observational studies are typically more limited and very hard to use to create observational knowledge of causation. This is because they don't remove all confounders, they don't remove all biases and chance, and therefore leave unbalanced studies as composed to experimental studies, which through randomization and through experimental design allow this to happen. So here we see a happy ending to an observational study, in contrast with the Scandinavian painter's study, but again, Snow went the distance and removed the pump handle, which ultimately was the definitive study in the cholera outbreak stoppage. Okay, we're done for today. We'll continue with another example in the next class of observational studies, one that you probably take for granted now as being true, but still is only an observational study, namely cigarette smoking and lung cancer. See you in the next class.